Torture, it is an ancient practice that still goes on today. In the Middle Ages, torture was used for punishment, interrogation, and deterrence. It is easy to consider ourselves more humane these days, but while some of the devices listed here would lead to death, we have, in modern times, mastered the ability of inflicting extreme pain for indefinite periods of time, something which is, perhaps, worse. With the head placed under the upper cap and the chin placed above the bottom bar, the top screw of this awful device was slowly turned, compressing the skull tightly. First the teeth are destroyed, shattering and splintering into the jaw. Then the eyes are squeezed from the sockets. Some versions had special receptacles to catch them. Lastly, the skull fractures and the contents of the head are forced out. In earlier stages, the torturer could keep the head firmly clamped and strike the metal skull cap periodically, each blow echoing pain throughout the victim's body. This procedure has remained essentially unchanged from the Middle Ages until today. The victim is hoisted up and lowered onto the point of the pyramid in such a way that his weight rests on the point positioned in the anus, in the vagina, under the scrotum or under the coccyx, the last 2 or 3 vertebrae. The executioner, according to the pleasure of the interrogators, can vary the pressure from 0 to that of total body weight. The victim can be rocked, or made to fall repeatedly onto the point. Nowadays this method enjoys the favor of not a few governments in Latin America and elsewhere, with and without improvements like electrified waist rings and pyramid points. Similar to the Judas chair, but probably worse, is the Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey was a device which consisted of a main board cut with a wedge at the top fastened to 2 crossbeams. The naked victim was placed astride the main board as if riding a donkey, and various numbers of weights were attached to his or her feet. The agony could be fine-tuned by using lighter or heavier weights. Sources relate that on occasion, the wedge would slice entirely through the victim as a result of the immense weight attached to his or her feet. This portable instrument of torture was popular in England and Scotland during the 1500s, but was seen as late as the 19th century. The scold's bridle was a cage that was locked around a woman's head as punishment for nagging and gossiping too often. Attached to this iron muzzle was a curb plate inserted into a woman's mouth to, literally, subdue her treacherous tongue. Most of these metal curb plates were spiked, averaging in length of about ½ an inch to an inch. The smaller spikes were a mild discomfort while the longer ones pierced the tongue and caused the victim to bleed continuously. To make matters worse, some curb plates had an additional round gag at the end which, when the device was worn, rested in the back of the mouth, irritating the throat. Some of these gags were shaped as animal heads to symbolically refer to her crime, e.g. donkey meant fool. Wearing the scold's bridle was far from a private affair. Women were taken through town, led by a leash, for people to see and know of her transgressions so that she may be ridiculed for them. If the verbal assaults weren't enough, women were stoned and beaten by the townspeople. The heretic's fork, as you may have guessed, was used primarily during the various inquisitions. The fork was a metal rod with 2 prongs at both ends attached to a leather strap worn around the neck. The top fork was placed on the fleshy part under the chin, while the other end dug into the bone of the sternum, keeping the neck stretched and the head erect at all times. Ensuring optimal agony was simple. A person wearing the heretic's fork was kept from lying down by either being hung from the ceiling or suspended in some manner that proved distressing. Those wearing the device were only able to murmur to their torturers. Any movement of the jaw would force the sharp prongs to further penetrate their skin. It was effective for long use because neither end pierced a vital organ, and blood loss was minimal. Victims usually died of sleep deprivation and fatigue. If crushing thumbs wasn't enough, the Chinese tianzu, using a similar concept, was used on all fingers in a gruelingly long process. A victim's fingers were placed on a flat wooden surface, where each finger was separated by sticks attached to strings. Refusal to answer questions or offer information resulted in the tightening of the strings which closed the device onto the prisoner's fingers, breaking them slowly. The tianzu was useful for a number of reasons. It was relatively easy to create, requiring little mechanical skill to assemble it. Crushing fingers not only delivered an extreme amount of pain, but the process could be repeated countless times. The unlucky victim strapped in the device would suffer for days, each time forcing their bones to crack again. These bones were damaged so badly, at times, that they protruded out of the skin from multiple crushings. Spider is a variation of that device, except more excruciating. This object had long metal claws, which were heated before it was fixed onto a woman's breast. If piercing soft flesh with a searing hot metal wasn't enough, the breast was then ripped off a woman's chest violently. This was the penalty for adultery or deliberate miscarriage of justice. Other uses of the Spanish spider were just as inhumane. Victims were pierced by the heated claws on their breasts, belly or buttocks, anywhere fleshy, and then hung from the ceiling. Their own weight caused the wounds and skin to stretch, and bleeding was near impossible to stop. People died hours after they were first suspended off the ground. The victim was locked into a seat with his back against a flat surface or a metal rod. His neck was strapped with leather, string or a metal band, attached to a wheel or crank in the back. The wheel would turn so his neck was crushed agonizingly slowly, eventually suffocating him to death. Variations of the garrote included a spike or blade which would penetrate the spine as the wheel turned to break the neck quicker or sever the spinal column. The kill was quick and silent, both appealing traits when you've got a lot of people to torture. The Spanish perfected the instrument, but it was popular in many cultures. It was last used in 1975 when a student was executed by use of the garrote, only to be later found innocent. The rack is a wooden frame with a roller at each end. Prisoners were strapped onto the mock table to keep from squirming, as their wrists and ankles were tied to a roller. They then began to turn in opposite directions, stretching out the body slowly until their joints were dislocated. This was a method used to gather information or confessions. Many prisoners had to watch other men suffer through the rack to implement a psychological fear in them prior to their own torture. When a man failed to speak, the rollers continued to turn, eventually forcing the arms to be yanked right out of their sockets. Variations of the rack had nails protruding from the wooden surface into the victim's back so as his body was stretched, the wounds would pull on his skin and muscles for additional brutality. This device, though seemingly simple, is a work of genius, in a cruel and unusual way, of course. A prisoner would place his thumbs between two flat metal pieces, connected by one or more screws. The metal bars had ridges, either smooth bumps or sharp spikes, that would bore into a victim's thumbs, trapping him into the metal mechanism as his bones were crushed. It was a small torturous device that inflicted extreme pain, without too much effort. The thumbscrew isn't as bloody or nightmarish as other items listed here, but think about an instant when your thumb was caught in the door or a drawer, magnify the pain and you might then understand just how horrifically dreadful thumbscrews really were. Similar inventions were used on toes, wrists, elbows and knees. Out of all the items on this list, the whip is perhaps the most familiar to us. Its basic design was admired throughout history, used in ancient Rome and remaining prevalent even up to the American Civil War, to discipline slaves. Today, the whip is still used as punishment in Islamic countries and Eastern nations. There are two main types of whips: the horsewhip, a flexible stick with a handle, and the traditional whip, a long, single strand normally made of leather with a stiff handle at the end. Variations of these include the bullwhip, braided leather, cat o' nine tails, multiple strands, knout, scourge and niddles. Some strands were tipped with metals and sharp objects to add further injury. Additionally, the whip was the first man-made object that could break the sound barrier. Let me repeat that so it can sink it, whips break the sound barrier. Traveling over 760 miles per hour, 340 meters per second, the crack of a whip is actually a small sonic boom. Remember, these objects were, and in some places still are, used on people as punishment. Strikes were so severe that pieces of flesh were torn right off, and losing an eye in the process was common. Victims would lose so much blood it was normal to fall into a state of hypovolemic shock. The crocodile shears was an instrument of torture used in late medieval Europe and typically reserved for regicides, those who attempted, and, perhaps, succeeded, to assassinate the king. The shears were made of iron and were based upon the concept of pincers, but, instead of standard jaws or blades, crocodile shears ended in a pair of hemicylindrical blades that, when closed together, formed a long, narrow tube. The insides of the blades were generously lined with teeth or spikes. After being heated red-hot, the crocodile shears were applied to the erect penis, which, once exposed to sufficient tension, was torn from the prisoner's body, or at the very least leading to severe arterial bleeding.